My maternal and paternal grandparents lived in identical houses separated by 3.5 miles of uninterrupted carriageway and a world of difference. Both families had relocated to their respective houses in the mid-50s and were the first tenants in the properties. To my father's family, who relocated from rural Liscalman, the outskirts of Belfast, must have felt quite urban, while to my mother's family, a move from a terrace in East Belfast would have made them feel like they were in the country. Both families, by all accounts, adjusted quickly to their new homes, and when the right to buy scheme was introduced a few years later, they had availed of the opportunity to purchase them. My mother's family home was an extremely happy one, full of love, laughter, and fond memories. I spent every weekend there as a child, and as the youngest in the family by years and their only granddaughter, I was smothered with love and attention. I often sat wide-eyed with wonder as my grandmother told me stories of her youth and growing up during the war. My uncle, their youngest, was still residing there during my childhood. I loved to wake him every Saturday morning and get him to play the guitar for me before we ventured out for the day. I was seldom more content than when I was in that house. On the other side of the carriageway, things were not so rosy. My grandfather was a frail man in poor health who had been unable to work for some years. My grandmother was a highly skilled dressmaker who was frequently commissioned to produce exquisite wedding gowns and other luxury garments. Her clients brought her items from the Jaeger shop, of which she produced exact replicas before they returned for a full refund. They had lost a child in infancy a couple of years before my father, their youngest, was born. It was said by many that she had never been the same. My father remained unconvinced. He had never known her as she had been before, and was of the opinion that she had always been a bitter, difficult woman, devoid of emotion. We visited them sparingly. My memories of her remain vague, as she died when I was quite young, but I recall being extremely intimidated by her. When my grandfather died soon after, and their house was left to my father, who to my mother's surprise was actually keen to live in it. And so in late 1987, we moved into a house that I could hardly bear to even visit, and there I remained for the rest of my childhood and beyond. I never felt at home there, a mere visitor only, and an unwelcome one at that. The first few years of our occupancy were plagued by disaster and misfortune, which culminated in the divorce of my parents and resulted in my father leaving, never to return. A few years later, my mother moved on and moved out, and the house came to be in my possession. Meanwhile, on the other side of the carriageway, my beloved grandfather had passed away, my grandmother had moved into nursing care, and my uncle, who briefly inherited their property, died suddenly just 2 years later, and the house was sold out of our family altogether. I increasingly felt that I had got the wrong house. I detoured past the property whenever possible and relished even the briefest glimpse of it as I drove by. I completely gutted and refurbished my house in an effort to make it mine, but of course it never was, and the unwelcoming presence was ever tangible. By late 2005, I accepted that I was concocting never-ending reasons to stay away from it, and just 2 days after Christmas that same year, I filled my car to capacity and deserted the place entirely. It lay vacant for a month or so before I put it into the hands of a letting agent who took care of things. I had nothing to do with it, only being notified of changes of tenancy, but no one stayed there particularly long, and I did wonder occasionally if they had felt as unwelcome as I did. It was only a few years ago, when the house had been empty for a few months, that I made up my mind to get shut of it altogether. With the exception of a couple of paintings of sentimental value, which I thought I'd stored in the roof space, I couldn't have cared less what happened to any of the contents. I was checking property prices on an estate agent site, comparing houses of similar age and style, when I spotted it. My maternal grandparents' house was for sale. I immediately made an appointment to view it. I was never going to buy it, of course. Too many years had passed, and I certainly wasn't in the market for a new home. But I had to feel it one more time, as if the very building itself had a heartbeat. When I pulled up outside, I could see that the house was decorated beautifully for Christmas. I paid great attention and interest as the owner showed me around. I didn't want them to guess that I was a fraud, but after the tour was over, I asked if I might look round myself. I paused in each of the rooms for moments only, shrouded in memories. I felt surrounded by comfort and love. I wondered if anything remained of my lovely family, perhaps some lonely relic languishing in the attic, or a black and white photograph jammed down the back of a skirting board. I thanked the owner and departed, and before I really knew what I was doing, I felt myself being drawn towards the house on the other side of the carriageway. I had avoided it for years by then, but I had an overwhelming urge to get the little I wanted from the house and wash my hands of it forever. I parked outside on the road and sat there for a while gazing into the dark, undecorated windows. The house was empty, unloved, forgotten. I ventured up onto the path and prised the front door open with difficulty as it was partially jammed with an avalanche of post. The familiar smell hit me first, an undistinguishable scent that was unmistakably my grandparents'. I hadn't noticed it in years. Feeling vulnerable for entering an empty house alone in the dark, I hesitantly checked the downstairs rooms before moving upstairs and pulling the Slingsbury door from the attic. I had a quick glance in the bedrooms and then tried to ignore my unease as I climbed the ladder into the roof void. I'd been up there only once or twice in my occupancy, and I remembered my need to be cautious. It had never been floored, which meant that items could only be accessed by walking from beam to beam with the precision of a gymnast. I marvelled at how much disused clutter can accumulate in a lifetime. Crockery and glasses of all shapes and sizes were boxed up beside brasses and framed prints by Constable and Gainsborough. Momentarily, I lost my balance and felt my foot connect with something under the insulation. I peeled it back to find a cardboard box sealed with parcel tape. Curious, I removed my car keys from my pocket and ripped it open. What lay inside, wrapped in fat quarters of fabric, was a collection of things made by a child, catalogued in order of date. I could see as the pieces became more intricate and detailed, the transition from childhood and adulthood, that they bore a signature which I had instantly known to be my father's. The writing on the back of the drawings, paintings and carvings, my grandmother's copper plate. I couldn't quite fathom why she had taken so much time to store and document the makings of a child that she hadn't shown the slightest bit of interest in. I couldn't find what I was looking for and suddenly felt an overwhelming need to leave. I descended the ladder and the stairs, switching off all the lights as I went. When I reached the front door, something made me pause and look towards the cloakroom. Nothing was ever stored in there except an old Singer sewing machine which was missing a treadle. With one swift movement, I opened the door, and there, nestled under the sewing machine, I found the paintings, again bearing my father's signature. I gathered them up without a backward glance and made off. Safely in the car, I knew that was the last time I would ever set foot in that house. But as I clipped my seatbelt in, my eye was drawn towards the landing window, where I could have sworn I saw a tall, thin, dark figure, set back very slightly from the pane. As I gazed transfixed, the figure gave me what could only be described as a slow motion wave, and then was gone. And so was I. Of course, I knew who it was, the enduring spirit of a woman turned to stone, but I can never be sure if she was giving me a sorrowful wave of goodbye or a wicked wave of good riddance, or if she was ever even there at all.